It's our pleasure to welcome you to a really wonderful event today. I'm Teresa Rogers, and I'm in the Masters of Children's Literature program here at UBC. And I'm just going to take one moment to tell you about this wonderful little program. It's a multidisciplinary program that has faculty from English, education, School of Library, Archival, and Information Sciences. Did I get that right? And creative writing. So it's a wonderful interdisciplinary master's program. And we just like to share that with you at meetings like this so everybody knows about it. And we're co-sponsoring this talk today with Jack Sipes, and we're really excited about it. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how it's going to go. We're going to have somebody introduce Professor Sipes, and then he's going to talk for about 50 or so minutes, and then he's going to take a few questions, and then we're going to have someone closing at the end. After that, if you'd like to stay and have book signing, I believe you're willing to sign some books. So anybody who has a book they want signed or wants to purchase a book and get it signed can stay after and do that. So welcome, everybody. This is a full house. It's wonderful. We have just enough seats, almost. Maybe we can just grab a few more from outside for the last two people in there. And so we'll get started. And so I would like to introduce the head of my department, the Language and Literacy Department, Jeff Williams, who is a linguist and who has a keen interest in children's literature and has been a great supporter of our program. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Williams.
Thank you, Teresa. It's a great privilege, of course, to be associated with the MA program in children's literature, and an even greater privilege to have the opportunity to introduce Jack Sipes. Let me start where I think we probably all start in some ways, with a brief story. All of us have stories about children and fairy tales. This one comes from yesterday and my bedroom, and sitting on the floor, and suddenly my 3-year-old said, "Dad, let's play the game of the raven and the clamshell." And she knows, of course, Bill Reed's sculpture very well. So we played that. I was obviously the raven, being big. The bedroom quilt was the clamshell, and she was the people. So the raven released the people from the clamshell, and then we went together to look over the sea. I, being the raven, said, "Well, let's fly." And she, being the people, of course, immediately wanted to fly. She put on her wings in the best Icarus tradition, didn't fly too close to the sun, and then suddenly decided that she'd like to fly to Australia. So we did. We flew to Australia, and then she defended me from some funnel webs which were emerging from some rocks, and as she knows from her recent visit, are very dangerous. Utopian tendencies in oddly modern fairy tales, and I'm going to broaden, of course, to the larger question of the oral tradition just for a moment, to say I think we all have these sorts of stories from the children we observe, and we all look for a way of being able to theorise these into academe in a way that elucidates not only their longevity, but of course their currency and their significance in the life of children. Those of us who were in English departments or perhaps in faculties of education in the early 80s, struggling to establish the academic integrity of children's literature, even to some extent the legitimacy of studying the oral tradition seriously outside of departments of anthropology, were enormously supported, encouraged, and in some senses I think legitimated by the appearance of books such as Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion and The Trials and Tribulations of Little Red Riding Hood. I could go on with, from my personal library, a large set of these books. But books that were very, very helpful. In my particular case, just to mention another, was the little book about the radical theatre in Berlin, the Grips Theatre, that Jack produced back in the 80s, to make a link with another figure who's been prominent in our discussions over the last couple of years. Aidan Chambers, I know, was also very much encouraged by the appearance of that book and the discussion of political theatre in Berlin. So it is indeed not only the ordinary kind of academic pleasure, but it's, I think, of deep significance to our work here at UBC to be able to have Jack Zipes to visit us and to talk to us about his work. So welcome on behalf of UBC and the MA in Children's Literature program on this occasion in particular. Professor Zipes has a long and distinguished career. He's a very young man, but he has a long and distinguished career. He's currently the professor of in the Department of German, Scandinavian and Dutch at the University of Minnesota, where he has been for some time, and he was the chair of that department during the 90s for I think 4 or 5 years. Previously he held positions at New York University, the University of Wisconsin, University of Florida. So he has worked in a range of different institutions, always very fruitfully. I think his CV is about 30 pages long, and I noticed that my file was the brief CV even then. He's a prolific scholar, a deep scholar, and somebody whom I think can take us very well into the theoretical significance of utopian tendencies of oddly modern fairy tales. Jack, welcome, and thank you for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Should I move this? Where are my technicians? I put this up. Can you hear me if I talk like this? Because I'm wired all over the place. Thank you very much, Jeff. I really appreciate the invitation. I've just had a wonderful time since I've been here. It's my first time in Vancouver. I do want to make one correction. I'm happily retired from the university, and I'm not as young as I may look. I'd like to begin with a tale that's really not a modern tale, but it's still being told in Bhutan. Bhutan's a small country north of India. And it's interesting because it's also been printed. And so you quite often, it's very difficult to make a distinction between something that is modern and something that may be 500 or 600 years old, because it comes back in different ways. Sometimes it also comes back through film. And this tale is called The Lazy Boy and the King. Once upon a time, there was a boy who was extremely lazy, and his parents decided to call him Olo Niilo, which means the sleeping boy, because he slept half the day, and then he might go for a walk, and then he would come back and sleep again and eat, and he would do nothing until he was 18 years old, and his parents decided to offer him to the king as a courtier, as a sepron. A sepron is somebody who always brings the meals to the king. And everyone began laughing. Olo would definitely fail at this and sleep most of the time, but he didn't. And he was soon promoted to the #1 sepron. And one time, when he brought the breakfast to the king, he began farting. And he farted and he farted, and the king was very, very annoyed by this and had him imprisoned. And when he was in prison, he began speaking to the guards and said, the king is not too bright because I'm the smartest and most clever person around, and he has all these foolish courtiers with him. And the guards reported this to the king, and the king said, bring him to me. And so Olo was brought to the king, and he said, if you're the cleverest and smartest person around, what can you do that really shows me that you are this way? Well, he said, I can make muti. Muti are these green pearls, and they're very valuable, and it would have made the king extremely rich, and he could have used it for his cloaks and his garments to make himself look extremely handsome. And he said, okay, if you can do that, then you will stay as my courtier. But Olo said, I need a friend. I need somebody to work with. Somebody who's never farted. And the king sent his messengers out into the kingdom looking for somebody who has never farted in his or her life. And they came back and they couldn't find anyone. And Olo said to the king, well, I guess you're the only one in the kingdom who's never farted. And he said, no, I farted. I'm just like everybody else. I fart. And Olo said, well, why did you imprison me? And the king was taken back. And the more he thought about it, he realized he had to release Olo from prison. And so Olo went home, and the king became very angry because he hated to be mocked. And so he ordered Olo to come back the next morning. He said, here are 2 pieces of a rock that were split. I want you to sew them together, stitch them together. Take them home with you. You better come tomorrow, otherwise you'll be back in prison. And so Olo went home and came back the next day, and he had the 2 rocks separated. And the king said, well, you're going to have to go to prison. And Olo said, I can stitch these together if you give me some thread made out of grains of sand. And the king said, well, that's impossible. And Olo said, well, is it impossible to stitch together 2 stones? And the king again was extremely annoyed and angry, and he banished Olo from the kingdom and said, you're never to return. Well, Olo went off and traveled around the world. And one time on his way, on his travels, he came across a dead horse in the middle of the road. And he chopped off the head, put it in a sack, and he said, I might be able to use this head. And he continued into the forest until it became night, and he decided to climb a tree and sleep in the branches because there were a lot of robbers in the forest. And below him was this sort of huge rock. It was flat. And just before he almost fell asleep, these huge ogres came out of the forest and gathered on the rock and started to build a fire. And then the leader of the ogres took out a golden cup and said to the cup, give us some churma. And churma is a very intoxicating drink, like beer. And the ogres began drinking the beer and having a great time. And then the head of the ogres said to the cup again, give us some food. And so food was spread all over the place. And then the ogre said, we want some delicious meat. And the cup spoke back to the ogre and said, there's meat above you. And at that point, Olo dropped the head of the horse so it splattered onto the rock. And the ogres saw this, and they became so frightened by this head that was so disgusting that they all ran from that rock. And the next morning, Olo climbed down and took the golden cup and began on his way again. And on his way, he met a man who had a bamboo shoot that he called a kayo. And he said, I'll give you this kayo for whatever you're carrying. I'll trade with you. And Olo said, well, what am I going to do with the bamboo shoot? I'm not a bamboo stick. I'm not going to thrash anything or weed or anything like that. And the man said, well, this is a special bamboo stick, a kayo. It can whip and smash all of your enemies, and you'll never have to worry about being attacked. And so Olo said, why not? Here's the cup. The man gave him the stick, and immediately Olo said, smash the young man. And so he got his cup back and moved along. And as he moved along, he met another man who also wanted to trade a hammer. And it was a magic hammer. And if you hit the ground, it would immediately build a castle within seconds. And again, Olo outsmarted the man and got the hammer from him. And then he moved along, and he met another man who was offering a drum made out of goatskin. And this drum, if you hit it, could create any type of weather you wanted, whether it was going to be rain or wind or sun. And again, Olo managed to get the drum from him. So he had the drum, the hammer, the stick, and the cup. And he thought to himself, I think it's time to go back and visit my king. And so he went back to the kingdom, and immediately he hit the ground with a hammer, and a huge castle grew out of the ground. And the king saw this, and he was astonished. And he said to his guards, "Go over and find out who created this castle. Where did it come from?" And the guards went over there, and they saw that it was Olo. And they ran back to the king, and the king was infuriated because this castle was much more gorgeous and huge than his own. And he said, "Go and arrest him." Well, they tried to arrest him, and of course Olo told his Kayo to beat them, and they ran back, black and blue, to the king. The king became extremely angry, and he sent his entire army over to the castle. And again, Olo asked his Kayo to do his bidding, and they also went back to the king, black and blue all over. And the king was now extremely infuriated, and he had his army surround the castle, limping. They were all beaten up, and he wanted to set fire to it. But this time, Olo beat the drum, and a huge thunderstorm came and doused the castle. Not only doused the castle, but it created a flood, and the flood demolished the king's castle and sent him and his entire army out into the sea, where they all drowned. And Olo became king of this realm and invited all the people to come and enjoy the fruits of his magic objects. Sorry. That's an example of a utopian tale. And it's interesting. I picked it up. I'm always stealing things and appropriating tales from other people. From a friend of mine who's a very well-known storyteller by the name of Joseph Sobol, who went to Bhutan and brought this tale back with him and is printing it in a journal. It's also appearing in a book that's being published in Bhutan. And it's interesting because Bhutan, which is supposedly, it's a very enclosed kingdom. It's very difficult to go there and to even gain entrance, and you have to pay a lot of money if you're going to stay there. And it's controlled by Buddhist monks and had a reputation of being extremely democratic. But when Joseph was there, and he spoke at a conference of other storytellers, there are a lot of conflicts that exist today. Because the monks have become very hierarchical and have a very class type of society which is extremely tightly controlled. And this particular tale circulates in Bhutan as a tale of resistance, a tale of protest. And I thought it would be a nice way to begin, because it really shows there are many qualities about the tale that I think will be borne out by what I have to say today about utopian tendencies in oddly modern fairy tales. Now, it would be misleading to argue that every story is told as utopian, or to assert that there is an essential utopian nature to storytelling. There is, however, a utopian tendency of telling that helps explain why it is we feel so compelled to create and disseminate tales, and why we are enthralled by particular stories. In his monumental 3-volume work, The Principle of Hope, written during and right after World War II, the great German philosopher Ernst Bloch, who had escaped the Nazis and was living in America, argued that our real life experiences are at the basis of our utopian longings. Because our daily lives that are not exactly what we want them to be, we daydream and we glimpse another world that urges us on and stimulates our creative drives to reach a more ideal state of being. To be more precise, it is our realization of what is missing in our lives that impels us to create works of art that not only reveal insights into our struggles, but also that shed light on alternatives and possibilities to restructure our mode of living and social relations. All art, according to Bloch, contains images of hope, illuminating ways to create a utopian society. Obviously, not every work that presumes to be art is artful, nor do all artworks necessarily contain a utopian tendency. But inspiring and illuminating images of hope can be detected in low and high art, in a Beethoven symphony, or in a hip-hop song, or in a grand Shakespeare production, or at a state fair, at a vaudeville. The utopian tendency of art is what propels us to reshape and reform our personal and social lives. In fact, Bloch points out that there are concrete utopias, short-lived experiments that have given real expression to new social and political relations. These concrete utopias set the building blocks for the future, for once hopes are tested and realized, we cannot betray them for long. We can never fully deny what has been concretized at one point in time. Among his examples are such major events in the world as the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution of 1917, as well as the Fourier experiments in France and the Brook Farm Commune in America, all which have left traces of how we might shape the future. These revolutions and experiments, and there are many more that can be cited, do not entirely succeed because the appropriate and conducive socio-economic conditions to maintain them did not and do not exist. Yet the very fact that they came into being for a short time reveals a great deal about the validity of our utopian longings that we continue to concretize in different ways daily. These longings are recorded as a spoken and written word. These longings are the source of ancient rituals and religions, as well as new cults. The belief in a better and just world has always been with us, and this utopian belief assumes a myriad of forms. For instance, the belief in miracles and life after death, articulated in religious legends and myths, stems from utopian longings. Salvation is predicated on the notion of a just world in which the oppressed will be guided and protected by a powerful divinity. Hundreds of thousands of tales in all religions have been spread with hope that we shall be redeemed after this life. But the more interesting utopian tales, in my opinion, focus on the present world. The utopian tendency of sacred stories is clear from the beginning. What is not so evident is how our profane and secular stories have a utopian bent to them and are perhaps more appealing and significant because they restore miraculous power to human beings. They tell us that we don't need kings or gods, presidents or politicians. In other words, they suggest that ordinary people can take power into their own hands and create better worlds for themselves if they know how to use their gifts. Stories help us. They help map out the terrain of utopia. They reiterate messages that we sometimes forget. In our most common stories, the utopian tendency is constituted by the actions of an ordinary, quite often naive character who manages to overcome obstacles or an adversary to achieve some kind of success. A good example is a cycle of Jack tales, and I don't tell this because my name is Jack, but it's a very interesting cycle that has been spread in the oral and written tradition in England, North America, and elsewhere. In his wonderful collection, The Jack Tales, Richard Chase, an American folklorist, remarks it is always through the little fella, Jack, that we participate in the dreams desires, ambitions, and experiences of a whole people. His fantastic adventures arise often enough among the commonplaces of existence, and he always returns to the everyday life of these farm people of whom he is one. End of a quote. The most famous of the Jack tales is, of course, Jack and the Beanstalk, which depicts a resourceful Jack who literally grows and grows up through his encounter with the giant and manages to gain a treasure in the course of action. There's another tale, another Jack tale, and it's called Hardy Hardhead, which is perhaps more interesting because it has many different variants in Europe and contains utopian implications. Here, Jack asks his mother to take leave so that he can free a king's daughter who has been bewitched. If he's successful, and many men have died, he can marry the princess. So when Jack enters the forest, he meets a weasedly old man who gives him money in a ship that can sail on ground. On his way to meet the ship, he takes on board 5 men: Hardy Hardhead, eat well, run well, hark well, and shoot well. These men have talents that will help Jack defeat the witch. He returns home and gives back the money to the old man. The narrator informs us that he does not know whether Jack married the girl, but at least she was no longer bewitched. As for the ship, the narrator confides in us, he knows for a fact that Jack kept it because he's been taken sailing with Jack on it several times. This is a delightful, delightful tale with many utopian motifs, such as the collective action of the 6 men whose talents are used to liberate an oppressed girl. In the Grimm's version, How 6 Made Their Way Through the World, the hero is an ex-soldier mistreated by a king, and he and his 5 friends defeat the king's daughter in a race and make off with the king's treasures that they shared together. In the Italian version, A Boat for Land and Water, Italo Calvino, retold by Italo Calvino, the hero is a youngest son. Here too he is helped by an old man in the forest, and after the young man completes his task, thanks also to 5 gifted friends, he builds a palace that houses his father, brothers, and companions, not to mention his bride. The theme of all 3 tales is liberation through collective action. The implication is that miserable conditions can be changed and evil can be overcome. There is hope for the oppressed, and this hope is carried by ordinary people like Jack, the soldier, and the youngest son. Naturally, they have some extraordinary help, but isn't the miraculous in these tales symbolic of the powers that reside in us, hidden potential that we haven't learned how to mine? The magic help from the outside is actually an energy or potential within us that we need to recognize in order to transform ourselves and to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. The hero receives a call from the outside in the form of an announcement. This call is actually from the future and sends the ordinary protagonist on a mission that will change his life forever, turn his world upside down, and bring more justice to the world around him. The miraculous transformation is a fairy tale motif that can be found in all types of stories from antiquity to the present, and is pervasive in our mass-mediated commercials, where quick, slick stories told on TV and movie screens and computer screens about beastly men turned into princes by the proper use of right shampoo, or the scraggly woman who looks like a queen after she uses the right lotion, drinks, running shoes, beverages, cars, are all magic gifts that can change our lives, if you believe these tales. Here, of course, we see the perversion of the utopian quality of storytelling. Utopia cannot be attained simply on the basis of individual transformation and enrichment. What is needed, as Thomas More long ago pointed out, is social and political change. And there are unusual cycles that address the conception of a paradise on earth, such as Atlantis, the Golden Age, Shangri-La, and Kukiana, also known in different languages as Kokanya, Lubeland, Luikaland, and Schlaraffenland, all connoting the land of milk and honey. Schlaraffenland, as a utopia, means nowhere. Utopia means nowhere. It is not a real, but rather a fictional and moral land. It has been created out of all sorts of intentions. Some Schlaraffenland tales envision a perfect government which does not exist because of the corrupt nature of people in the world and also cannot exist. The storyteller's intention in portraying such a government is to show more clearly and more freely the incomplete nature and foibles of monarchies, aristocracies, and democracies. Others seek to represent the misery and struggles of human life. According to the Schlaraffenland tradition, this is why storytellers and writers create such countries or islands on which one can have everything without work. For instance, there are images of seas full of wine, streams of beer, forests with fried chicken and fish hanging from the branches. One need only picture Pieter Bruegel's famous painting, The World Turned Upside Down, of 1559, also known as Netherlandish Proverbs, to imagine what is meant by the Schlaraffenland or Kukanya as the land of milk and honey. Indeed, Bruegel was so intrigued by the stories of Luikaland that he also painted the land of Kokanya in 1567. The excess behavior of the characters in the Kukanya stories is somewhat disturbing. People eat, sleep, drink, carouse, exchange roles, and turn the world upside down. Chaos seems to be the ruling principle of Schlaraffenland. Yet there are some historical factors that must be considered if we are to understand why the characters in these tales seem so voracious, boisterous, crude, and lustful. Most of the tales in the Kokanya, and Schlaraffenland cycles arose during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and they are connected to the Carnival, Mardi Gras, and folk traditions, when people were permitted on the day before Lent to become kings for a day. That is, people were allowed to let their hair down and assume the roles of their rulers and oppressors, to dress up and do as they please without fear of being punished. In addition, given the great famines during this period, feasting became a major part of the celebration, and to eat to one's content became part of the celebrations. To break all the rules of decorum and to live for pleasure was a political act. For it was during this time that the daily life and work were becoming more regulated and rationalized. Leisure time was becoming more and more a luxury, and peasants were compelled to treat time more like money. With the rise of the middle classes and mercantilism, the socio-economic system demanded work and accountability and less time for pleasure. Laziness was a sign of protest. Perhaps one of the more interesting documents about the milk and honey tales is actually a 16th century Italian folk song entitled A Chapter that tells about the existence of a new world found in the sea Oceano, which was based on different folk tales, probably sung and told by sailors. The narrator begins by reciting how seafarers found a beautiful land in the sea Oceano where nobody ever dies. There is one mountain made out of cheese, and on top is a kettle a mile wide. In this kettle, macaroni, remember this is an Italian tale, macaroni is cooked. And when the macaroni is ready, it spurts out of the kettle and rolls down the cheese mountain to a house with forks where people can eat as much as they like and drink wine out of the springs. All the trees are filled with cake and cookies, and a river of milk flows through the land. Everything grows there without difficulty. Grapes and figs, melons and other fruit. The woods are filled with fried chicken and other game. The weather is so wonderful that clothes are not needed, and all the boys and girls run around naked. For them, our decorum is foolish and crazy. Everyone is young and lives for 1,000 years. Then they die in their sleep. There are no sicknesses, pain, and suffering. Each person lives cheerfully and enjoys each second of the day. Everyone has what he or she wants. And if someone were to think about working, the others would hang the person, and heaven would not save him. Everything grows by itself, and the donkeys are tied with sausages. Nobody has anything on his or her mind other than dancing, singing, and making music. The king's name is Bugaloso because he's the fattest and laziest person there. In fact, he's so fat that he never moves and never wants to exert himself. Money streams from his rear. And when he spits out marzipan instead of lice. He has fish in his hair. There are no peasants there because everyone is rich. When one wants to sleep, one only has to find a bush equipped with sheets and pillows made out of down. It is not necessary to worry about having too many children to feed because when it rains ravioli. The houses are made out of the finest gold and all the fields are shared and free. What a wonderful land, sings the teller of this song, or singer of the song. The sun and moon never set, the people never quarrel or fight. The song ends with the singer commenting something like, "Oh, what a beautiful place. Oh, what a glorious land. How stupid it is to stay where I am any longer. I would like to head for this island and live near the beautiful mountain. Whoever wants to go there, I'll tell them the way. He only has to take a ship in Mameluke Harbor and then sail over the Sea of Lies. And whoever arrives there will be the king of those fools." Now, despite the wonderful irony of the song at the end, it has a powerful appeal because it articulates the real needs of the common people and illustrates their wishes and desires. Typically, the contours of this utopia are depicted in the extreme, so that there is a burlesque and grotesque quality to the narrative. This radical manner of introducing the motif of utopia, also to be found in tall tales and trickster tales, is intended to burst the seams of the status quo and provoke listeners to move ahead in their lives with laughter and optimism. The utopian tendency in storytelling does not accept things as they are and seeks to expose human foibles, hypocrisy, and injustices. There are many types of utopian tales, and the utopian tendency of ancient tales about paradise has led to the science fiction tales of the present. But the tendency, as the tales reveal, is not simply in the narratives themselves. The tales are articulations of the utopian tendencies within us that we cultivate from childhood to death in our endeavor to seek immortality. One need only watch children at a playground to see how early the utopian tendency in storytelling develops. Left alone to play, which rarely happens anymore, left alone to play, children will begin talking to themselves and will invent a magic kingdom and a narrative to express their wishes and desires. Or they will join with other children to act out a story or play a game that has a storyline to it. A playground filled with laughing and somewhat wild children is not unlike Bruegel's The World Turned Upside Down or A Land of Milk and Honey. As they talk and run about, the children seek to grab hold of their lives and map out their destinies, not knowing where they are going, but knowing that there is a land or home out there that will suit them. As Oscar Wilde once said, and I'm quoting Wilde, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth looking at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing." And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country, sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopia. And one might add, the tendency toward utopia is kept alive through storytelling. At their best, fairy tales constitute the most profound articulation of the human struggle to form and maintain a civilizing process. They depict metaphorically the opportunities for human adaptation to our environment and reflect the conflicts that arise when we fail to establish civilizing codes commensurate with the self-interests of large groups within the human population. The more we give in to base instincts, base in the sense of basic and depraved, the more criminal and destructive we become. The more we learn to relate to other groups of people and realize that their survival and the fulfillment of their interests is related to ours, the more we might construct social codes that guarantee humane relationships. Fairy tales are not only utopian, but they are also uncanny because they tell us, as I've already indicated, what we need, and they unsettle us. They unsettle us by showing what we lack and how we might compensate for lack. Fairy tales hint of happiness. This hint is what Bloch has called the anticipatory illumination. We create works of art that contain traces, signs, forms, patterns that anticipate and illuminate the ways into the future. As I've already stated, these hints of happiness have constituted their utopian appeal that has a strong moral and political component to it. We do not know happiness, but we instinctually know and feel that it can be created and perhaps even defined. Fairy tales map out possible ways to attain happiness, to expose and resolve moral conflicts that have deep roots in our species. The effectiveness of fairy tales and other forms of fantastic literature depends on the innovative manner in which we make the information of the tales relevant for the listeners and receivers of the tales. As our environment changes and evolves, so we change the media or modes of the tales to enable us to adapt to new conditions and shape instincts that were not necessarily generated for the world, that we have created out of nature. This is perhaps one of the lessons that the best of fairy tales teach us. We are all misfit for the world, and yet somehow we must all fit together. We are all misfit for the world, and somehow we must all fit together. Not only are we struck by their utopian verve, fairy tales have an extraordinary, uncanny power over us, and the French critic Georgian locates this power on the conscious level in the way all good fairy tales aesthetically structure and use fantastic and miraculous elements to prepare us for our everyday life. Magic is used paradoxically not to deceive us, but to enlighten us. On an unconscious level, Jean believes that the most startling fairy tales bring together subjective and assimilatory impulses with objective intimations of a social setting that intrigue readers and allow for different interpretations according to one's ideology and belief system. Ultimately, Jean argues that the fantastic power of fairy tales consists in the uncanny way they provide a conduit into social reality. Yet given the proscription of fairy tale discourse within a historically prescribed civilizing process, a more careful distinction must be made between regressive and progressive aspects of the power of fairy tales in general to understand the liberating potential of contemporary tales for all human beings. Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny and Bloch's concept of home can enable us to grasp the constitutive elements of the liberating impulse behind the fantastic and uncanny projections in fairy tales, whether they be classical or experimental, modern or postmodern. In his essay on the uncanny, Freud remarks that the word heimlich, the German word heimlich, means that which is familiar and agreeable, and also that which is concealed and kept out of sight. And he concludes that the word heimlich is a word, the meaning of which develops in the direction of ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite unheimlich, or the uncanny, or literally unlike home, or unfamiliar, something very unfamiliar. Through a close study of E.T.A. Hoffmann's fairy tale, The Sandman, Freud argues that the uncanny or unfamiliar, that is the unheimlich, brings us in closer touch with the familiar, with the heimlich, because it touches on emotional disturbances and returns us to repressed phases in our evolution. Freud insists that one must be extremely careful in using the category of the uncanny, since not everything which recalls repressed desires and surmounted modes of thinking belongs to the prehistory of the individual and the humanity and can be considered uncanny. In particular, Freud mentions fairy tales as excluding the uncanny. In fairy tales, for instance, the world of reality is left behind from the very start, and the animistic system of beliefs is frankly accepted and adopted. Wish fulfillment, secret powers, omnipotence of thoughts, animation of inanimate objects, all the elements so common in fairy stories can exert no uncanny influence here, according to Freud, for as we have learned, the feeling that cannot arise unless there is a conflict of judgment as to whether things have been surmounted and are regarded as incredible may not, after all, be possible. And this problem is eliminated from the outset by the postulates of the world of fairy tales. Although it is true that the uncanny becomes the familiar and the norm in the fairy tale, we immediately accept everything that goes on because the narrative perspective accepts it so totally, there is still room for another kind of uncanny experience within the postulates and constructs of the fairy tale. That is, Freud's argument must be qualified regarding the narrative machinations of the fairy tale. However, I don't want to concern myself with this point at the moment, but I'd like simply to suggest that the uncanny plays a significant role in the act of reading, hearing, or viewing a fairy tale, and using and modifying Freud's category of the uncanny. I want to argue that the very act of reading, hearing, and viewing a fairy tale is an uncanny type of experience in that it separates the reader from the restrictions of reality from the onset and makes the repressed unfamiliar, that is the unheimlich, once familiar once again, makes it more heimlich, more homey once again. Bruno Bettelheim, I'm not a particular fan of his, but Bruno Bettelheim has noted that the fairy tale estranges the child from the real world and allows him or her to deal with deep-rooted psychological problems and anxiety-provoking incidents to achieve autonomy. Whether this is true or not, whether a fairy tale can actually provide the means for coping with ego disturbance, as Bettelheim argues, remains to be seen. It's true, however, that once we begin reading, and by we I mean adults and children, I just don't focus on children the way Bettelheim does, once we begin reading, hearing, or viewing a fairy tale, there is estrangement or separation from a familiar world, inducing an uncanny feeling, which can be both frightening and comforting. Actually, the complete reversal of the real world has already taken place before we begin experiencing a fairy tale on the part of the storyteller, be it a writer, artist, or filmmaker. The storyteller invites the listener, reader, viewer to repeat this uncanny experience that the artist has undergone. The active process of reading, hearing, and viewing involves dislocating the reader, listener, or viewer from his or her familiar setting, and then identifying with the dislocated protagonist so that a quest for the heimische, or the real home, can begin. The fairy tale ignites a double quest for home. One occurs in the recipient's mind and is psychological and difficult to interpret, since the reception of an individual tale varies according to the background and experiences of the recipient, reader, viewer. The second occurs within the tale itself and indicates a socialization process and acquisition of values for participation in a society where the protagonist has more power of determination. This second quest for home can be regressive or progressive, depending on the narrator's stance vis-a-vis society. In both quests, the notion of home, in German Heimat, so the notion, the term Heimat, which means home in German, is related to heimlich and unheimlich. In both quests, the notion of home or Heimat, which is closely related etymologically to heimlich and unheimlich, retains a powerful, progressive attraction for readers of fairy tales, while the uncanny setting and motifs of the fairy tale already open us up to the recurrence of primal experiences. We can move forward at the same time because it opens us up to what Freud calls unfulfilled but possible futures, to which we still like to cling in fantasy, all the strivings of the ego which adverse external circumstances have crushed, and all our suppressed acts of volition which nourish us in the illusion of free will. Now, obviously, Freud would not condone clinging to our fantasies in reality. Yet Bloch would argue that some are important to cultivate and defend since they represent a radical or revolutionary urge to restructure society so that we can finally achieve home. Dreaming which stands still bodes no good, I want to quote from Bloch. But if it becomes a dreaming ahead, then its cause appears quite differently and excitingly alive. The dim and weakening features, which may be characteristic of mere yearning, disappear. And then yearning can show what it really is able to accomplish. It is the way of the world to counsel men to adjust to the world's pressures. And they have learned this lesson. Only their wishes and dreams will not hearken to it. In this respect, virtually all human beings are futuristic. They transcend their past life, and to the degree that they are satisfied, they think they deserve a better life, even though this may be pictured in a banal and egotistic way, and regard the inadequacy of their lot as a barrier and not just as the way of the world. What Bloch means by the good content of dreams is often the projected fantasy and action of fairy tales, with a forward and liberating look. Human beings in an upright posture strive for an autonomous existence and non-alienating setting which allows for democratic cooperation and humane consideration. Real history, which involves independent human self-determination, cannot begin as long as there is exploitation and enslavement of humans by other humans. The active struggle against unjust and barbaric conditions in the world leads to home or utopia, a place nobody has known, but which represents humankind coming into its own. Philosophically speaking, then, the real return home or recurrence of the uncanny is a move forward to what has been repressed and never fulfilled. The narrative pattern in most fairy tales involves the reconstitution of home on a new plane, and this accounts for the power of its appeal to both children and adults. It is not only the timeless aspect of traditional fairy tales that interests Bloch, but also the way they are modernized, mediated by film, and appeal to all classes and age groups in society. Instead of demeaning popular culture and common appeal, Bloch endeavors to explore the adventure novels, modern romances, comics, circuses, country fairs, and the like. He refuses to make simplistic, qualitative judgments of high and low art forms. Rather, he seeks to grasp the driving utopian impulse in the production and reception of artworks for mass audiences. Time and again, he focuses on fairy tales as indications of paths to be taken in reality. Now, it's not by chance that both Freud and Bloch, who were born at the end of the 19th century, took a great interest in the fairy tale and in the power of the uncanny and the imagination. By the end of the 19th century, the fairy tale had become fully institutionalized as a genre in the Western world. It was firmly rooted in all the oral traditions of Western nations and also other nations throughout the world. And folklorists had begun avidly collecting tales from all cultural groups in the world and translating them into English. Almost all the great writers in the United Kingdom, continental Europe, and North America had written fairy tales or had used fairy tales in their major works. The first great filmmaker, Georges Méliès, had immediately turned to fairy tales as sources for many of his early films in the 1890s. Painters, illustrators, designers, musicians, choreographers, dramatists based major works on fairy tales or incorporated fairy tales into their works throughout the 20th century. But the fairy tale did not celebrate cultural progress and advanced industrialism. The flowering of the fairy tale that spread in all art forms and cultural fields of production throughout Europe and North America during the latter half of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century had a great deal to do with alienation. As daily life became more structured, work more rationalized, and institutions more bureaucratic, there was little space left for daydreaming and the imagination. It was the fairy tale that provided room for amusement, nonsense, recreation, and also critical commentary. Although many of the fairy tales were ironic or ended on a tragic note, they still subscribed to the utopian notion of the transformation of humans, that is, the redemption of the humane qualities and the overcoming of bestial drives. By the beginning of the 20th century, the fairy tale had become fully institutionalized in Europe and America, and its functions had shifted and expanded. The manner in which the fairy tale has attracted writers, artists, and musicians and incorporated other art forms into its own institution reveals the vital role that adults have played in maintaining the genre. Never has a fairy tale ever lost its appeal to adults, and the fairy tale for adults or mixed audiences underwent highly significant changes in the 20th century that has made it look both oddly modern and also commercially conventional. I won't go into, because I want to draw this talk to a close slowly, but I just want to mention that in the development of the fairy tale in the 20th century, there have been two big poles. And one, of course, has been the commercialization of the fairy tale, not only through Walt Disney, but through the entire culture industry, has tended to deplete the fairy tale from its critical utopian verve. Whereas there are many amazing writers, including Margaret Atwood here in Canada, but also A.S. Byatt, Angela Carter, I could go through a list, of Robert Coover in America, many superb writers and also filmmakers who have created films that have kept alive that sort of utopian verve, and storytellers throughout North America that have really tried to maintain that essence, that utopian essence that I've talked about. I was going to close on a note of hope, and I still will. And I had prepared a closing, but I'm going to change that closing because yesterday I went on I'm always on the email as my wife, or the internet as my wife will sustain. And I belong to different blogs. And one of the blogs is called Once Upon a Blog. And it's run by, I think it's a woman, I'm pretty sure it's a woman. She calls herself Gypsy. I don't know who she is. And this blog, I discovered it last fall. And it's daily. And it's amazing. It's filled with the most trivial things in the world. But with amazing amount of information about the fairy tale, what's being produced, and she gets excited about everything, and there are images. I don't know, she must spend all her time working on this blog. I think a lot of bloggers do that. But this is a very unusual blog, and sometimes there are pauses like 2 or 3 days, and then all of us, and she'll apologize and so on. And the other day, here in Vancouver, I went on, I got the blog. It hadn't arrived for about a week or so. And I was wondering what was going on. I wasn't concerned or anything like that. And so I got this message, and I want to close by reading the message from this blog. My apologies for the sudden lack of posts and for not answering emails the past couple of weeks, at least. I've decided to share what's been happening for me and mine in the hopes that others having difficulties will be encouraged that they are not alone. So here's the most personal post I've written for Once Upon a Blog so far. I have houses on the brain. You see, to put it bluntly, we are losing ours. I almost wrote home. But in the days since finding out that this was not a possibility, but an actuality, it's become very clear that home will be wherever my little family ends up. It's not dependent on a building or a location, or even our stuff. As long as we're together, we'll be home, and everything will be okay. Everyone knows that the economy is in a terrible state, but it's not till it starts affecting people you know and your own family that you realize how widespread it is. We've known the possibility of moving was there for a while, but facing it, especially under these circumstances, which are complicated and personal, as the thing that has to happen, was shocking, devastating even. Once we began talking about the difficulties we've been having, though, lots of people began to confess they were in hardship too. And I do mean lots. All the secrecy, shame, the hiding heads in the sand, and the fear are contributing to people not learning what they should about their situation and what their options truly are. This is the main reason I want to share. No matter where you are in your troubles with finances, jobs, and the lack of them, and housing, you always have a choice. This is one of the very important lessons I've learned from fairy tales. Bad things happen. Sometimes it's your fault. Sometimes it isn't. No matter what you do, you have choices. Maybe they're not nice choices or easy choices, but it's empowering to actively choose instead of just having everything happen to you. For us, the choice has been to proceed with what's called a short sale. It's not what we wanted, but we believe it's our best option at this juncture. It's tricky with banks changing the rules every few weeks, and incredibly frustrating when you've been trying to negotiate a loan modification for over half a year. But being active in what happens to us in the future makes us feel less like victims and more like we're managing a bad situation for a better outcome. Knowing we are doing everything we can to put things right means we can move forward with fewer regrets and reduce our chances of ever being in this situation again. I'll continue to post at Once Upon a Blog when I can, during these challenges, but please forgive the lack of daily fairy tale news until the changes are complete and the dust settles. To all those facing trouble of all kinds, hang in there. You're not alone. We're right there with you. And we're determined to make it out the other side. Yes, we're trudging through a very dark part of the woods. And yes, there most definitely are wolves. They come in all shapes and sizes. The worry continues and the stress is high. And we are human after all. But we know that there's a way through and that there's a they lived happily in our future to look forward to. Sincerely, Gypsy. Thanks.
While you're formulating your questions for Jack, I just want to say thank you for such a powerful reminder of how powerful our stories are, our oldest tales. So thank you. I would like to invite anybody who would like to ask a question. If you would be, I know you'll ask me to go, but we would like to invite you to ask a few questions of Jack. And this doesn't seem to be turning off, so you're going to have to speak up. Does anybody have a question?
Do you think that perhaps
Could you stand up?
with the uncanniness that is so easily accessed on the internet in the way in which it is done, do you think that perhaps people are becoming too acquainted with uncanniness and too comfortable with it?
Are you referring to the way, like, let's say, in horror films or Dracula novels and so on and so forth, how the uncanny is being used in those types of works?
Yes, but also specifically on the internet and how, like YouTube and sites like Facebook, they're so easily accessed, and there's kind of this world of uncanniness to it that people have such rapid access to.
Yes.
And it's often lacking some root or authorship.
No, a lot of what passes as uncanny, that is the horrific or grotesque or macabre and so on, is not necessarily what I would call uncanny. But nevertheless, I wouldn't minimize popular culture so much. In fact, I think we can learn much more from popular culture sometimes than so-called high culture, because all of the disturbances that people have in the world today come out. It's the rise. It's what Freud talks about as the revenge of the repressed. So that everything that's buried and disturbing in us somehow manages to seep through, both consciously and unconsciously, in all sorts of forms. And I would say that if we, consider, all the types of outbursts and explosions that are happening, even in America with this stupid Tea Party movement, is very important. But it's important to take that seriously, because these people, though they may be, to a certain extent, caricatures of real human beings, they are demonstrating something that's upsetting that they don't understand. They haven't come to terms with it. And so I think that everything, we're living, one of my favorite sociologists is Zygmunt Bauman, who's written many books about we're living at a time in what he calls a fluid society. There are there's no stability in this world anymore, and the flux is so great that it's very difficult to define who we are, and what we want. And because of that, I think there is this sort of rise or explosion, you could say, and you can even include terrorism to a certain extent, among this sort of contributing to the uncanniness that's happening in the world itself. So that's how I would begin to try to analyze what is happening, the uncanny, all around us. Yes?
Could you maybe speak on the popular book, Emin's Dark Material?
Yes.
Really taking on Christianity.
Yes, yeah. Well, I can only say that I love his work. And I think that, he's not Richard Dawkins. There's a movement among atheists in response to the movement of religious fundamentalism that is very, very interesting because, to a great extent, atheists have kept their mouths shut for a long time. And it's happening in works by philosophers. Dawkins is he's not only a biologist, he's a philosopher. But there are other excellent books that have come out by philosophers in the United States, and biologists and evolutionary psychologists, the interest in evolution. So I think that Pullman's work, which I think is absolutely profound and makes the Harry Potter novels look like banal stories written by an infantile. I think that it's very important to take him extremely serious. And it's interesting that for a long time his books were sleepers, that not too many people were reading, but gradually, I think because of the conflict that is ongoing in this world, more and more, and younger people, it's amazing that even 11 or 12 years, it's very complicated, as you know, very complicated to read Pullman, but surprisingly, a lot of young people have. And so I think that we need more and more writers like Pullman, and there are some wonderful, like M.T. Anderson in the United States, and I won't go through a list of writers, but I think, again, that's an indication of the conflict-ridden world in which we are, and that there is this dispute in different cultural domains that are being really, to a certain extent, irrationally. I wouldn't say Pullman's irrational, but irrationally it's being displayed in very irrational ways throughout the world, not just in the United States. Yes?
I really like to comment on how they're using objects in commercials as magical objects to achieve utopian dreams. And my question sort of is kind of, the way that I see it now is, I can't remember the philosopher, but I read somewhere that the ideas of the people, of liberation, of resistance, capitalism takes it and sells it back, ironically enough, to the people. And I'm just wondering how this reselling of utopia and emptying out of what fairy tales mean, to sell them back these images images defined by a patriarchal society of what, for example, female identity in fairy tales is, and selling it back, and how, if you can elaborate more so on that in the commercial aspect of the fairy tales today.
Capitalism thrives on innovation. Without and it produces it because it's technologically it's becoming much more efficient and amazing in how the modern day technology can make virtual reality seem to be reality itself. And so we live at a very confusing time, again, as Bauman tries to illustrate. And but I believe that it can only continue to produce anew to a certain point, and people realize how empty the promises are that capitalism produces. So all the products that they're trying to sell, all the messages, will eventually backfire. When it will eventually backfire, I'm not a prophet or anything like that, but essentially, it is extremely difficult to resist because the capitalist system in all domains, culture, economy, politics, you name it, university, for instance, my university, one of the reasons I'm very happy to have retired is become a corporate institution where the sciences are dominant and the humanities are being squashed. So it's happening all over. But eventually, and this is the hope that I have philosophically, people feel their alienation. This again is why you get a Tea Party movement that is maybe irrational, and there are many other movements in the world that are like that. They feel empty. And also people at the top feel empty, but they don't want to give up their power because these are very privileged positions. So for the time being, I think that there's nothing you can do that won't be co-opted. Hip-hop, where did that come from? The streets of the Bronx. Do you think that the people in the Bronx have made any money off hip-hop? No. But every wonderful movement in the or development in the arts, sciences, and so on begins with very simple, everyday people, scientists who are very good scientists who are not out to necessarily change the world or make a lot of money, will create something, and then a corporation will grab hold of it. The best artists are bought off by Hollywood, because that's where they're going to get money and be able to do things that they might not be able to do, and so on. So until I think people in societies realize or come to the realization that they are being emptied out, their spirits are being demolished, will things really change? But again, I thought that was going to happen in the 1960s. I'm a remnant of that period, and things did not turn out the way that I thought they would. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah.
I'd be interested if you would just give us a quick sense of how you think maybe fairy tale motifs function in the notion of environmentalism and the environmental movement. There have been books written for children, the green books written for children, but and there are some novels. Fairy tale novels. There's a French writer who I'm forgetting his name, about 10 or 15 years ago, wrote an amazingly utopian type of green, what I would call a green novel. It hasn't really, I would say the dominant resistant motif or in fairy tales has come from the feminist side, and some of the fairy tales written by, I'm thinking of The Green Woman in a collection that I published called Don't Bet on the Prince. There's a short story in there which is definitely part of the ecological movement, but it doesn't seem to have had such an impact as the way either social class, sort of portrayal of social classes in fairy tales, contemporary fairy tales. And the other thing that's interesting is that race has not entered into the fairy tales, that there aren't too many interesting contemporary fairy tales that sort of talk about race relations. So that's about all I can say on that point. Yes?
You were speaking very convincingly about the civilizing and demoralizing influence of fairy tales.
Yes.
And you gave us a fairy tale right in the beginning.
Yes.
Polo. But at least two of his treasures he gained by immoral means.
Yes.
Would you like to comment on that? Is that society, a particular Putin society, a particularly violent society?
Yes.
Or particularly immoral? Do
Yes.
they encourage immorality?
Yes.
I would be interested in
Thank you that's a good point. Yes?
It's also lazy. How you became so wise to kid to lie with people, and he was lazy. He didn't.
Yes. I think that we, and I hope this is not a rationalization or but we have to look at tales metaphorically, and it is true, that and so that his sort of immoral behavior comes out of a necessity to a certain extent that shows his inability to bring about a revolution, to change things without some type of violent means. And unfortunately, that may be true. We've seen that in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or all sorts of revolutions, that you at certain points, and that's why I said I'm not too sure what's going to happen in the future in America or anywhere, that I don't think, given the deeply structured forms of power, whether it's absolutism, monarchy, or capitalism, armed struggle might have to take place. Some type of, in other words, the protagonist, Olo, would have been killed or imprisoned for the rest of his life if he hadn't used armed struggle. And he, of course, was being attacked later on. But in order to, he did steal these magical things. But you have to sometimes, as long as your purpose, to a certain extent, is different from those people who want power or domination, and he wanted to share what he got with the rest of the people in the end. It is tricky. It's very ambivalent. I think that there are other tales that I would, for instance, another version, if I had told how 6 made their way through the world, which a discharged soldier gains revenge and doesn't steal, or just enlists the help of some of these really, that's a tale I prefer. But I told this tale because I'd recently come across it. I thought it was interesting, and I myself would not say that it carries with it the type of humane, civilizing, utopian motif that I would like. How 6 made their way through the world is a tale that I love to tell, and I do think that I would offer that up rather than the tale that I told.
I think we're going to have to close. I would just like to, but do stay afterward if you can to talk with Professor Seitz. I'm just going to invite Judy Brown from our English department and our program member to come up and close for us. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Well, I first wanted to offer thanks to Professor Seitz from Green College, which has been sponsoring him here through the Cecil H. and Ida Green Visiting Professorship. Also to thank the MA program in Children's Literature for hosting this event this afternoon. Special thanks to Jane Flick, who has created this possibility and these wonderful events for us. And also to Judy Saltman, Chair of the MA Program in Children's Literature, and Teresa Rogers, who is acting chair while Judy is on leave. I felt this afternoon as if we've been treated to a banquet of ideas and stories and images, compelling storytelling from Professor Seitz, a talk that conveyed to us challenge and hope, and always reminding us of the profundity of really modern fairy tales. I think I'll take away from this banquet this afternoon a lot of images. Can't get Olo out of my brain, for one thing. I will never look at mac and cheese the same way again. And I love the idea of raining ravioli. So the next time that you're walking through a Vancouver rainstorm, think about ravioli. And the idea of children at play, creating their own fairy tales and performing fairy tales and remaking them. And all of us as adults being reminded to reconnect to fairy tales if we think that they're only for children. So we're ever so grateful for your
talk this afternoon, Professor Zipes. And the MA program in Children's Literature has a small gift for you in return for the mighty gift that you've given us in the last little while. Thank you very much.